What's the one thing that you hope you will have accomplished 4 years from now?
As president, I'd like to get our government working again. To me, the big issue this country faces is the fact that we don't do anything anymore. Because of hyper-partisan politics, extreme ideology, and gridlock, we don't actually make progress. And there are a lot of issues that we need to make progress on, because the world is changing really fast. And a lot of our country's been left behind by the pace of change, whether it's technological innovation or globalization. And there are real things we need to do. We need to help workers by increasing the earned income tax credit. We need to fix our broken healthcare system, but not throw the whole thing out the window, which some people are proposing. We need to reform our immigration system. We need to start addressing climate change and start getting actually something done. We need a better long-term fiscal trajectory of the country, and so some measures need to be taken to rebalance that. We need a new authorization for military force so that actually our servicemen and women who are engaged all over the world actually know that the American people are behind what their mission is, because right now it's open-ended. And these are basic things that a responsible nation would do. And we have not been a responsible nation for the last several decades. And I want to be the president that actually gets America working again. And to get America working again, you need real solutions, not impossible promises. You need ideas that actually are workable. You need to tell the American people how you're going to pay for them. And you need to tell the American people how you're going to get them done. And that's what my campaign is about. And so in 4 years, when I look back, I want to see a country that's more unified and less divided, which doesn't mean we agree with each other on everything. But what it does mean is that every once in a while we roll up our sleeves, find common ground, and get things done, whether it's building infrastructure or any of those other things I talked about. I think a national service program would help kick off a new era, because it would create and instill a sense of service in this next generation of Americans. And I think the American people would look at it and be proud that we did something like that. So that's kind of what I'd like to see in 4 years. I'd like to see America working again.
Okay, so you've been in Congress under both Democratic and Republican presidents.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen it from that side.
Mm-hmm.
As president, what do you do to get government working again?
So I think you need an inside and an outside game. The outside game is making the case to the American people all the time, right? And so one of the things I've proposed is that in the first 100 days, my administration will just advance 5 or 6 big ideas on issues that, on issues that really matter: infrastructure, immigration, healthcare. But all of them will be based on existing bipartisan bills in the Congress. I won't change a word of them, because I know they're there. I worked on a lot of them. There are some actually really good ideas where good-minded Democrats and Republicans have found common ground. I think it would be amazing if the president actually championed them, because he or she would be able to look at the American people and say, you know, I actually represent every one of you, which is why I'm going to focus initially on things where there's broad agreement. So that's kind of your outside game. Really constantly speaking to the American people that this notion, you know, that we're all in this together, you know, united we stand, divided we fall, that is actually the beating heart of this nation. And it's worth fighting for every day of our lives. But then you got to have an inside game. And to have the right inside game for domestic policy, because on foreign policy, the president has a lot of discretion. But on domestic policy, the president really can't do anything transformative without the Congress. So in many ways, going back to my business days, the Congress is your client. And you got to work your client all the time. You got to have a member of Congress over the White House for breakfast every morning, right? You got to develop those personal relationships. You got to figure out how you build coalitions, because in coastal states, the majority of Republicans actually think climate change is a problem. So as president, if I need to get something done bipartisan on climate, like I did when I was in the Congress with the only bipartisan climate bill introduced was mine, you say my coalition is all the Democrats and the Republicans who live in coastal states. So you got to have an inside game and an outside game. And I think you've got to be relentless in playing that game every day. You're always going to the American people and making your case as to why your ideas make sense. They're common sense. They appeal to kind of mainstream America. And they're things we should be doing. And the inside game is figuring out how you build the coalitions of the Congress to get it done.
The opioid crisis is an issue of particular concern around
Yes.
here. And about a half hour ago, we received by email in our newsroom a comprehensive plan
Yeah.
that you proposed for this. It's filled, understandably, with a lot of process and bullet points.
Sure.
I wonder if you could just dial in and speak in human terms about what this part about ensuring evidence-based treatment for all means.
So there are things that are working, because I've done roundtables here in New Hampshire. I visited treatment centers. I spent a bunch of time in my own district on this issue. I traveled around with law enforcement and saw what they were dealing with in terms of this crisis. And you realize there are actually interventions that are really working, that are actually making a difference with addiction generally and with opioids in particular. And so I think we need to be funding what's really working. So that's part of it. I mean, I believe in evidence-based approach to everything, including this issue. So when I think about how we're going to have to deal with this opioid crisis, you have to get at the conditions that created the environment for this to happen. And to me, there were three things. There's a lot of economic despair, dislocation, and economic insecurity, which is a fancy way of saying a lot of communities have been left behind economically. And with that comes depression, despair, disconnection, etc. And that has contributed to it. I think we have a healthcare system that lacks parity between mental health and physical health. Right? Mental health claims are 4 times more likely to be denied than a physical health claim. Here in New Hampshire, your Medicaid rates are so low for mental health under Medicaid that you can barely find a provider. I think they're twice as high in Vermont next door. Right? If you're a mental health provider, why wouldn't you just go over there where you can get paid twice as much for a Medicaid claim? That creates a situation where, maybe there's a Medicaid mental health benefit in New Hampshire, but good luck trying to find someone who takes it. So we got to create parity in the mental health system. So you got to get at the conditions that led to the creation of this crisis. You got to get to the healthcare system that is broken, particularly around mental health. And then you got to obviously get to what these pharmaceutical companies did, which to me was just tragic. I think they knew exactly what they were doing. I mean, this whole opioid crisis was based on an original assumption, based on some early scientific work, that these things were not in fact addictive. And that's what led to the prescribing guidelines that were clearly wrong. And I think they knew that they were wrong. These companies get data every half hour on everything they sell all over the world. It's at the dashboard of the fingertips of the CEOs. They knew exactly what was going on. So there has to be accountability there so that it never happens again. So you got to get the economic conditions, and then you got to get the healthcare system, and then you got to have accountability. Right? That's all kind of big picture. But then you got to deal with all the, we lose a Vietnam a year to this thing. Right? It's just, the scale of this is staggering. And the fact that no one talks about it, I tried to get a word in edgewise at the debate on this. No. They ask about the Mueller report. No one cares about the Mueller report, in truth. They really don't. They care about this kind of stuff. And, so when I say evidence-based interventions, we all know there's things that work. They're different in communities. The things I hear work here are sometimes different than what you hear in Maryland or other places. We got to back what's working. We want to make sure the resources exist at the delivery level so that people who have addiction get the care they need, have alternatives for pain management treatment, and, we're backing things that work.
With regard to mental health, a consequence of that is a burgeoning suicide rate.
Yeah.
Can you talk specifically about anything that you view as a path forward to dealing with that side of the
Suicide
issue?
rate or mental health?
Yeah, suicide rate.
Well, it's mental health ultimately at the end of the day. Again, I think we have a mental health crisis in this country. There's 40 million Americans who self-identify as having a mental illness. And we all know the number's much greater than that. I think every single family in this country has a mental health issue in their family if you ask them about it and they're honest about it. I think we got to destigmatize it because you shouldn't be ashamed of having a mental health issue. You got to get rid of the bias that exists in the healthcare system. People have to be comfortable talking about it. Family members have to be comfortable talking about it. You got to deal with some of the factors that are driving it, which I touched on earlier, which is economic despair. A lot of it with young people is social media. Teen anxiety is growing like crazy in high schools. We haven't put any policing on the social media companies. They create devices that are addictive, and they program programs that are addictive. There's an issue with our veterans, because they weren't able to get the mental health care that they needed. So, I think this is real crisis level stuff. And, you know, it was funny, I was at an event yesterday and someone asked me, like, what is the issue that as president I want to, was it a synagogue, it was an interfaith thing. We had a really interesting dialogue about a variety of issues, not really policy specific. And the last question was, what area do you feel like you need to still explore more? And I think it's this, because, you know, I've got a million solutions as to what we should do. And there's structural things to do to fix healthcare, things to do this. But there's an underlying driver of despair and anxiety in this country right now, which is causing an addiction crisis, which is causing people to feel more lonely than they've ever felt, yet they're more connected than they've ever been. And I just think we haven't really gotten our head around how a lot of the changes that are happening in the world are really affecting people's mental health.
Just go to climate change for a sec.
Sure.
So, one, we just kind of want to hear a little more about how, you know, what kind of public resources you would put towards mitigating the effects of climate change, but also in your kind of inside game, outside game framework, how, you know, you mentioned these coastal Republicans, but also what about folks who, you know, may not really see an immediate economic benefit to any of these plans? How do you convince them, you know, to buy in for the long term that may benefit people who aren't even born yet?
You know, that's the problem with climate change. The political system is not well suited for slow-moving disasters. The political system is really great for dealing with like something right in your face. But for a slow-moving, ticking time bomb, like climate change or the fiscal trajectory of this country, the political system is really bad. So if you think about how to deal with climate change, you can't wait for the climate deniers, because that's ridiculous. Right? They're just denying it. Who knows why? But you also can't say, I'm going to solve this problem on the back of hardworking Americans who are barely getting by. You know, half the country can't afford a $500 surprise expense. You've heard all the stats. 40% of the American people can't afford their basic necessities. You can't go to them and say, you know, you're just going to have to spend a lot more money so we deal with climate change. Because they're going to be like, I'm not going to do that. And you'll never get any of it done. Which is why the approach I've taken, in my opinion, can get done and is very much pro-worker. So the first thing I would do is put a price on carbon. And I introduced this bill in the Congress, and it was bipartisan. It puts a fee on carbon, or a tax on carbon, or a price on carbon, whatever you want to call it. And it'll cut greenhouse gas emissions by 90%, according to the modeling that was done on the bill. But what you do that's unique about the bill is you take all that money and you give it back to the American people in a dividend. So it goes out one pocket in the other. So when I sit down with a hardworking American and say, this is going to increase your energy costs if your energy comes from fossil fuels, that's the point of it. We don't want you to use them as much. But you're also going to get a check every year. And by the way, that check's going to be equal to more than the increased cost of your energy. Because a carbon dividend fee, if the dividends are distributed equally to every American, is effectively progressive. If you calculate energy costs by incomes and everyone getting the same dividend. That I can get past. And that'll be a big first step. And it's very different than what other people have tried. You know, the president of France put a price on carbon and gave the money to tax relief for wealthy French people, and people put on yellow vests and protested because they're like, don't solve climate change on my back. The governor of Washington, Jay Inslee, he's tried to get a carbon tax bill passed twice in a very democratic state, but it always failed. Why? Because he was putting a price on carbon, raising the energy prices for the average American, and the government was going to keep the money and invest it in green energy projects. That sounds good, but no one actually trusts that that'll actually be good for them. So you have to take the money and give it back to the American people. So that's the first thing I would do, and that'll slow it down. But second thing is you got to be realistic about this problem, because it's a global problem. And China and India and Africa are opening up a coal power plant every week. The developing world, who's just finally getting into the global economy, and they're lifting lots of people out of poverty, you know, it's very hard for us to say to them, don't do what we've been doing for the last 100+ years. So we basically, as a country, have to do what we've done best, which is innovate our way out of this problem. I believe the United States of America, which has unmatched intellectual capital and an unmatched innovation economy, has to actually put all of that against this problem, which is why I've called for a 5-fold increase in the Department of Energy research budget, because we and the world needs new battery, and storage technology, which is why I've called for the creation of a whole new industry called direct air capture, which is a fancy way of saying CO2 vacuums. These are machines that actually exist. The National Academy of Science just did a huge review of the technology. They suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. They work. And then you can take the CO2 and you can either store it in big cavities or you can use it for other productive purposes.
Like enriching oil, because some of the companies that own
Yes.
the boat, yeah, they're.
But the problem with these machines is they're too expensive and they're not of scale. Their cost is anywhere from $200 to $600 a metric ton, and the social cost of carbon right now is about 100. Now, if you put a carbon price on carbon, these things start becoming more viable. But that's exactly what I would have said about wind and solar 30 years ago. I would have said, hey, these things work, but they're really expensive and they're subscale. But what did we do? We created a market for them. And the innovation economy took the basic technology and did what it did best, which is to scaled it and made it cheap, and now it's cheaper than fossil fuels. I want to take the $50 billion of tax credits that we give fossil fuel companies and use them to create a market for the government to buy carbon that has been captured and stored at the lowest price, which will drive huge innovation. And I believe, and we'll locate these machines in the center of the country, which is why I want to build a carbon throughway, which is effectively a pipeline laid in the natural gas pipeline right-of-ways to transport the CO2. I know it sounds like science fiction, but unless we do this, we will not get to net zero by 2050, which is what we have to do. And the reason I say that, and again, I'm the only one who actually, I think in many ways, speaks the truth. We produce CO2 a bunch of different ways. The biggest is through the production of electricity. We can actually get that to net zero with renewables and nuclear. We can get off fossil fuels for electricity production. That's good news. Cars produce a lot of CO2. We can get them all electrified. It's good news. But you know what the problem is? There's no electric planes. There's no electric ships. Manufacturing itself produces CO2. Not just the electricity that's needed or the power that's needed, but the manufacturing process itself produces CO2. And then farming produces CO2. You can mitigate it, you can offset it, you can do a whole bunch of things, but it still net produces CO2. So if we want to get to net zero by 2050, we actually have to offset those things. And the only way to do that is through capture. So, and the nice thing is if we do this, if the United States rises to this challenge, which I believe we can and we always have, particularly when these technologies exist, this is actually not as hard as people think. It just needs resources and a real moonshot approach. I think we'll save the world as well.
Just a quick follow. How much leeway would you give, local and state communities, and also how much leeway do you give private industry in carbon capture when currently fossil fuel companies are some of the biggest funders of these, programs?
Well, listen, fossil fuel companies, the fact that fossil fuel companies fund these programs, a lot of people view it as a negative. I actually think the reason they're doing it is obvious. If you pull out the securities filing for ExxonMobil, their SEC filings, they disclose, they believe in the future, governments will put a price on carbon. They disclose that in their financial statements to their investors because they actually believe that. And one of the ways they think they can handle that is through capture, which is why they're investing in it. But there's two types of capture. I'm talking about different types of capture. There's capture on site, meaning you run a fossil fuel plant and you capture the CO2 that gets produced. That's what they care about.
But they also fund the vacuum ones.
Yeah, but it's the same technology in a way. But the vacuum technology, if you will, is where I think there's a lot more promise. Because I want to get off fossil fuels in the traditional sense of it. But I'm also realistic that we produce CO2 other ways too, and we don't have offsets for those other things. Now, there is some interesting things. I think the United States has a role here. There's a facility that opened up in Houston, Texas. It's called an alum cycle facility. It was named after a British scientist named Richard Alum. And Richard Alum basically came up with a new way of creating energy through natural gas. Because right now, if we all owned a natural gas power plant, we would take the natural gas, we'd burn it, we'd heat up water into steam, and the steam would turn the turbine, it would produce electricity, and CO2 would go in the atmosphere. Less than a coal plant, but still CO2 would go in the atmosphere. And we got to stop that. What the alum cycle does is it's a new way of using electric power. So you don't heat up steam You don't heat up water and produce steam. You actually liquefy the natural gas, and it turns the turbine. And this facility has been opening and operational for about a year, and it's net zero. It produces no CO2. What we need to do as a country is we need to basically give these things to foreign countries. Instead of opening a coal power plant, they should open these things. But that's the way we got to think about this problem. We have to innovate and solve the problem. I believe by 2100, the way we produce, distribute, conserve energy will be so radically different that we'll actually get to net zero, and we may not need the CO2 vacuums. But by 2050, which is 30 years away, and right now 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, which is the same as it was 5 years ago, we have to get to net zero by 2050. We have no choice, or the world warms more than 2 degrees Celsius, and the United States has to lead in solving the problem.
So that's
Sorry about all that detail.
No, thank you.
that's some big thinking.
Yeah,
So
but it's practical too, because you can get the American people behind everything I just said. Because you know what that industry, we were doing the modeling, you know what this industry is going to create? This carbon capture? 350,000 jobs. That you can sell to the American people. Literally, 350. If you figure out capturing 20% of the CO2, and you do some comparison about manufacturing and other things about making these machines and operating them, it's 350,000 jobs.
well, you
a
can
big
also create a lot of jobs through work on infrastructure.
Yeah,
You have a
$2 trillion plan.
$2
Fully paid
trillion
for.
plan.
Yeah.
So what are the priorities in that, and how are you paying for that?
So let's go through the 2 trillion, and then I'll go through how I'm paying for it. So the 2 trillion includes massive increase to the Highway Trust Fund, which is the main way we fund infrastructure, which is funded by the gas tax right now, plus taxpayer money, because we haven't increased the gas tax since 1992. So I'm calling for us to increase the gas tax. And that'll plus up the Highway Trust Fund quite a bit. The second thing I'm calling for is the creation of an infrastructure bank, which gets capitalized once, right, with $50 billion, and then over 50 years can have, hundreds of billions of borrowing, et cetera, associated with it. And then I'm calling for the creation of a bunch of matching grant programs around climate resilient infrastructure, around water infrastructure, around infrastructure in communities that are distressed economically, where the federal government's putting up basically 80% of the money and the local governments have to put up 20%. And each of these programs are about $50 billion each. So the Highway Trust Fund plus up, the infrastructure bank, and these programs add up to $2 trillion. The way it's paid for is, one, I already told you, which is the increase in the gas tax.
Yep.
And the second way I pay for it is by raising the corporate tax rate from where it is now at 21 to about 27%. And I'll tell you why I think that makes sense. The corporate tax rate was 35%. It's the highest in the world. And it was hurting our businesses. So it was right to lower it. I proposed lowering it to about 27%, 28%. President Obama proposed lowering it to about 27, 28%. The business community advocated for 25%. The Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, all these groups would come to Washington and say, if we had a 25% tax rate, we could really compete globally. So most of us thought that bid and ask, if you will, was 25 to 28. That when we ultimately did corporate tax reform, that would be where the corporate tax rate go. Suddenly, I'm standing on the floor of the House of Representatives, and the GOP announces their tax cut plan. And it's at 21%. And I was like, no one even asked for 21%. Like, literally, no one asked for that. The only reason it was 21% is because the president said 20 when he campaigned. Without any thought, he just said 20. And they couldn't do 20 through reconciliation. They had a very complicated balance. They had to raise it 1 point to get it done through reconciliation. That's why it's 21%. So I'm going to move it back up to 27%, which is where it should be. That'll allow U.S. companies to be competitive. And I know a little bit about this. I started 2 companies, took them public. I understand what we need to do to be competitive. But every 1% of corporate tax rate raises about $120 billion. So that does the rest. So that's how I fund the whole program. And this is an area I spent a lot of time on in Congress, because I introduced $1 trillion infrastructure bill when I was in the Congress. And it was bipartisan, 40 Democrats, 40 Republicans in the House, and about a dozen Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. And it was based on what made it innovative. And just to be clear, I had the head of the Freedom Caucus, a guy named Jim Jordan, on the bill, and I had the head of the Progressive Caucus on the bill. So I had the polar opposites on this bill. But the way that I had structured it back then was I effectively created $1 trillion of infrastructure funding, and the way I paid for it is by reforming the international tax system. You know that money that was trapped overseas? Remember the whole repatriation thing?
Yeah.
So I reformed that in a way that made it more competitive, and it generated hundreds of billions of dollars. The Republicans took my exact proposal and put it in the tax bill, but they cut off the infrastructure part. And they used the money generated from that to help pay for their tax cuts. So effectively what I'm doing is turning the clock back, and I'm going to say, well, what you should have done is used my paid for and actually funded infrastructure, so that's what I'm going to do as president. So that's my $2 trillion infrastructure program, fully paid for. And I just think it should be the cornerstone of the Democratic Party. Democrats, Republicans, Independents agree we should be building infrastructure. It's got to be roads and bridges. It's got to be rural broadband. It's got to be water. It's got to be energy infrastructure. It creates jobs. You know, it puts people to work with good middle-skilled jobs. It improves the lives of our citizens, and it helps our businesses compete. It's a no-brainer, and it's going to be a big part of my administration.
So the rural broadband part, you propose a rural broadband matching fund.
It's 80%.
What does that mean? What's being matched and by who?
Well, the local government's got to put up 20% of the cost, and we put up 80.
Okay.
So for every dollar local government puts up, we put up 4.
What if local government doesn't put up any money?
Well, you could also get it through the infrastructure bank. There's other ways of doing it. But I wanted to have some specific, because in the infrastructure bank, that allows for communications infrastructure to technically be used too.
So that
But listen, an 80-20 matching grant is really attractive to a local government and a state. They'll figure out ways. I just think you want to have some skin in the game, because you want to make sure they're doing the right projects. I mean, the federal government doesn't know if they're doing the right projects. How do we know in Washington, like, what you need here? But if you put up 20 cents of the money, my bet is you know what you're doing. So I do kind of like those programs. That's how the Highway Trust Fund works. Mm-hmm. You know, you get these grants from the government, but local governments have to put money in.
So, this is more of like a philosophical question that you may not have had time to answer during the debate on education. So, you know, just kind of long term on two things. One is just, you know, general access to college for Americans and how you see that. A lot of the debate centers around free tuition and debt forgiveness. But another is also just kind of in terms of what the government is funding, where do you see a balance in terms of, you know, kind of specialized STEM and vocational programs versus just more broad-based liberal arts learning?
So, I mean, in reality, I'm kind of pro both, right? I think a liberal arts education is very valuable. I mean, I had a great liberal arts education. But I also think we got to educate kids with the skills they need to get jobs. So I think there's got to be the right balance. But let me come back to that and how I think about education. So I think we've got a lot of needs in education. I think we need more early childhood, because the 0 to 3 programs, so many poor kids don't get access to them that they just never catch up. You know, a poor kid starts kindergarten and they've heard a third of the words other kids have. They're just always behind. So we need more 0 to 3. We should have universal pre-K in this country, because it's the best investment we make. I think teachers in lots of parts of this country are really underpaid, and I'd like to provide relief there. I think when kids get out of high school, they need something, and I'd like to make community college or career and technical training, I view them as the same, available to kids as part of basic public education. And I'd like to provide some relief to the student debt crisis we have, because it is a crisis. But as you can see, I think we got a lot of needs educationally, which is why I think this notion of that Bernie Sanders has and Elizabeth Warren has to some extent of writing off all these student loans are crazy. I mean, it's just crazy. If you had $2 trillion to spend on education, God willing you're in that position, I mean, I would apply it across all these needs. You know, I don't want to write off loans of people who can afford to pay them off. I don't know what I would say to the people who basically just paid off their loans, that, sorry, you shouldn't have done that. Or the families who actually saved like for decades to get their kids school paid. Or the kids who are about to go to school, nothing for them. Or the people who decide to become an electrician, like my dad, and got a skill training and didn't go to college, nothing for them. So I just think that's I think it's pandering. I think it's buying votes. I think it's terrible. Now, I want to put, I've got a proposal to create universal pre-K. I got a proposal to expand early childhood. I got a proposal to make community college and career and technical training part of public education, meaning free. I'm effectively calling for pre-K through 14 to be the new K through 12. Last year about 70% of our high school graduates were not eligible for the military, according to the military. So obviously these kids need something after high school to get ready for the world. I'm not for free 4-year college because A, I think that would suck up too many resources away from all these other things. And B, I think it basically sends a message you got to go to college and get a 4-year degree, which I don't think you have to. I just don't think you have to. I think we got to reimagine college. I'd like to see college be 3 years. The easiest way to cut 25% off the cost of college is to make it 3 years. I haven't met anyone who doesn't think college, considering all the technology that exists these days, couldn't be 3 years. Or law school couldn't be 2. The world's changed, and these universities really haven't. In fact, they've become more expensive. It used to be 30, 40 years ago, 15% of an average person's wages were what a college cost. Now it's 70%. So it's kind of broken. And I want to fix that too. And it's hard to do. You got to create incentives and all these kind of things. But that's how I think about education.
So you've been bouncing around the state now for long enough that this has probably come up. Education funding is an issue here. When you're proposing adding to the public burden at both ends,
Yeah.
who's paying for that?
I think the federal government's got to roll in some of that stuff. I really do.
How?
I mean, look, at the end of the day, I'm also very aware of the limited footprint the federal government has in public education in this country. This is largely a locally run operation. And that's got problems with it. It makes the funding very inequitable in many ways. Because if you live in a wealthy town, there's more tax base and you get more money in public schools. And if you live in a poor neighborhood, there's less tax revenues and schools aren't as good, which also makes it racially unjust. But people like it that way, and that system's not changing. So I'm very mindful. So one of the proposals I've had around universal pre-K, for example, is to create a proposal where the federal government provides block grants to the states that they have to provide some matching against to create, provided they have an eligible pre-K program. So I think from the federal government perspective, it's a lot of carrot and sticks to actually change behavior, and it's probably mostly carrots. I think the federal government has a lot of say in post-high school education because we provide the student loans. And we shouldn't provide student loans to universities that don't graduate their kids or where their kids don't get jobs. So there's a big way the federal government can change things. The federal government can change how these loans are repaid. I favor more income, percentage of income repayment programs as opposed to just fixed payment programs, for example. So I think there's real things the federal government can do with post-high school. I think as part of a national service program, you can also create ways to make college more affordable, because I got this big national service program that I've rolled out. And I think the federal government has some ways with carrots to actually encourage certain behavior and effectively think about it as the K through 12, which I'd like to see pre-K through 14 track.
And where does the supply of carrots come from?
Well, the one thing I have proposed is part of my tax policy. So I'll tell you the taxes I've proposed raising, right? Because we might as well get those out of the way because it leads into this. I've told you how I've talked about moving the corporate rate up. I would like to make capital gains rates the same as ordinary income rates, which is what Ronald Reagan did, by the way, because I don't think investors should pay the same rate as workers. I mean, I don't think investors should pay a lower rate than workers. I think it's the biggest loophole in our tax system. We treat investors like they're endangered species. like unless they get a really good deal on their tax rates, they don't invest. That's just not true. I mean, I was in that business my whole career. Wealthy people are going to invest every nickel they have, whether the tax rate's 20 or 30%. So that's a loophole I propose closing. And then to fund universal pre-K, I've proposed a dedicated tax on wealthy Americans. So Americans making, over $750,000 a year, that they'll pay a small educational surcharge that goes to a lockbox that funds the block grants to create universal pre-K. Because as my sense, a lot of wealthy Americans dedicate a lot of their philanthropy, in fact, to early childhood education. They understand that it's a really good investment. So I think I can sell a very small 0.5%, 1% surcharge wealth tax to people if they know 100% of the money is going to establish early childhood education in this country. So that's how I pay for
How do
it.
you roll out this universal pre-K where there are school districts that may have it already and others that don't?
Well, if you have it already, it would probably free up some dollars for you to do some more things. Because everyone ought to be eligible for the same thing. You see what I mean? And we might say, if you have it already, which is great, you can get this provided you continue to allocate the same amount of money to early childhood or other things. Because you wouldn't want to use this as an excuse for them to pull a lot of money away from education. But you got to also give them the same thing everyone else gets. You shouldn't be punished for doing the right thing.
So let's talk a little bit about healthcare.
Sure.
You oppose the Medicare for all
Yeah.
idea. I guess that's the current catchphrase.
Yeah.
But you do propose universal health
I do.
care by adding a public option to, I guess, what the infrastructure that's already there through the ACA.
Yeah.
So as you do that, you also want to detach health coverage from employment. Yes? Or
I want to change the tax
oversimplifying that.
So why don't I go through
Sure.
the plan? It might be easier. So first of all, again, I'm a pragmatic idealist. What I want to do in my first 100 days is fix the Affordable Care Act. Because I thought it was a good law. I really did. I think people who call it incremental progress are crazy. I mean, it passed by one vote. 70 Democratic House members lost their seat over it. And I thought it was a big step forward. I really did. There were things about it that were great. Medicaid expansion, I think, was terrific. Protection of pre-existing conditions were terrific. The way the exchanges were set up were flawed. And those need to be fixed. Because the exchanges created some unhealthy cross-subsidies. Meaning, you know how the exchanges work, right? We passed a law as part of the exchanges that said if you're over 55 and under 65, when you're 65 you're going to Medicare. When you're over 55, what the law under the ACA said is that those folks can't be charged more than 3 times the cheapest policy. So I'm 56. If I went into an exchange, by law, they couldn't charge me more than 3 times the cost of the cheapest policy they would offer a 21-year-old young, healthy male. And that's a problem, because my healthcare costs on average are 6 times that person's cost, actuarially. So they basically capped what insurance companies could charge people over 55 and under 65. It's not a coincidence that the AARP starts representing people at 55. And as a result, the insurance companies and the exchanges had to basically charge young people and working families who are, say, 40 more than their actuarial health costs. And the young people who think they're invincible said, well, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to pay the fee and leave the exchange. And so what you left with was kind of escalating prices on people who were 40 years old, if you will, with young families. And that's what caused the exchanges to start collapsing. It was just basic economics. Cross-subsidies have real problems with them. So I would fix that. And there's a couple ways of fixing that. You could let the people over 55 into Medicare. You could create a reinsurance pool where you take the people who are in these exchanges who are particularly ill and have very high cost. You get them out of the exchanges in a general federal risk pool where you can spread the risk better. All of that stuff will make these exchanges work. And that's what I want to do in my first 100 days. So what I just told you is my practical solution to fixing the ACA. Then what I would like to do is have a public option. I think a public option is a really good idea. I think the Medicare provider network is a terrific way to have a public option. That would be a huge step forward. And then when people ask me what I would ideally do, if I could really do a complete remake of the healthcare system, then I have a plan called Better Care, which creates universal healthcare. And that's what I think you were referring to. So I wanted to take you through how I really think about a president and fixing healthcare. Right, you got to fix the ACA, then you got to try to do a public option, but then you should have a goal, an ambitious goal for universal health care. My universal health care builds on the Affordable Care Act. So the first thing it does is it leaves Medicare alone. Medicare works, it's not perfect, but people like it, so just leave that alone. Because again, I have this philosophy, you fix what's broken and you leave what's working. Medicare's working, so don't touch it. What's not working is the tragedy of uninsured Americans, which is ridiculous. In a country as wealthy as ours, everyone should have health care. And what also is not working is Medicaid, which is a really broken program, as you know here from your New Hampshire Medicaid. So I would create a universal health care system where everyone gets a federal health care plan from when they're born to they're 65. And when they're 65, they go on Medicare. But unlike the single payer proposals, I wouldn't make private insurance illegal. So if you got your basic government healthcare plan, right, so you were handed this plan, you got it as a citizen, it would have basic coverage, kind of similar to the Affordable Care Act minimum provisions. But you may say, you know, I want more stuff than this. So I'm not going to take this, I'm going to go get a private insurance plan. You could say to the government, I don't want my plan, you'd get a tax credit, and you could use that tax credit plus your own money and buy a private plan. Or you could take that tax credit and give it to your employer, or you could take that tax credit and give it to your union, and it could be used to buy your own private plan. Or you could get that government plan and say, you know, I kind of like this, but I want a few more options. I'm going to buy a supplemental plan, like Medicare beneficiaries do. That, what I just described, would create a universal healthcare system where you have healthcare as a right from when you're born to you're 65. But you'd have options. It's called a mixed model system. It's what Germany has. It's what France has. It's what Sweden has. It's what the Netherlands has. It's not a single payer system, which is what Bernie Sanders has proposed and Elizabeth Warren has proposed. That makes private insurance illegal. I think that's a terrible idea. Because one, I think 150 million Americans have private insurance. And 100 million of them like it. Including Medicare beneficiaries who have something called Medicare Advantage, which is private insurance. If we run on taking that away from these people, we will lose to Donald Trump by 10 points. Because he'll spend $1 billion scaring the American people that the health insurance that you like, the Democrats are going to take away for no reason. Terrible idea. But it's also a bad idea as a matter of policy. Because if you look at healthcare in this country, Medicaid pays 80% of cost. Medicare pays about 90% of cost. Private insurance pays about 115 to 120% of cost. So if Medicare were the only payor, it wouldn't cover the cost of healthcare. Like I was in the Elliott Hospital a couple months ago, you know the Elliott Health System here. And I asked the person running it, how would it be for you last year if all your bills were paid at the Medicare rate? Because they're about a third Medicaid, a third Medicare, and a third commercial insurance. They're like, well, if all those bills were paid at the Medicare rate, we'd probably close. Because Medicare doesn't pay enough. And in the Medicare for All bill, it specifically says Medicare rates will be targeted to be the way consistent with what they are now. So the bill, as I read it, basically says that there's going to be a dramatic decrease in access to healthcare because they just won't pay the cost of healthcare. And that will result in an underinvestment in healthcare. So that's another reason I think it's a terrible idea. My system, I think, is much more practical. It solves the problem. It keeps what's working. I've got it fully paid for. It's paid for by, you'd have $1 trillion of Affordable Care Act subsidies you don't need anymore. And I would eliminate the corporate deductibility of healthcare as part of this. That saves $4 trillion. And you don't really need it anymore because everyone would go to their company and they basically have their government plan which the company would either negotiate a supplemental for, or they basically turn in their tax credit, and that would be used by the company as a subsidy to buy their health care, and it kind of gets you to the same place. Sorry to go through that in such painstaking detail.
No.
That's okay.
There may not be a more contentious issue in this country than immigration right now.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to share your views on what, to your view, effective immigration reform looks like. But I wonder if you could touch on two other sort of timely topics, and that is the nation's asylum laws and rules, are they right? And number two, this report that came out this week that chronicles and details the dangerous overcrowding situation in these border holding centers. Specifically the Mother Jones report, the
Yeah.
jaw-dropping photos and the
Right.
break into the Inspector General
Yeah.
report.
So, I mean, it's terrible. So on immigration, I would put the 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill in my first 100-day agenda. It was bipartisan, passed the Senate with a lot of Republicans. Obama would have signed it into law, would have passed the House if it ever got a vote. I think it's a great deal, and that's where the American people are, and I'm going to push to get that done. So that's what we have to do. And you're familiar with that bill, I assume, the 2013. We have to do that. And so that's where I stand on immigration. On the border, a couple things. So my wife and I went to the border in January. We went to Dilley, Texas, which is the largest detention facility in the United States of America. And when we were there were 1,700 women and children. And the reason we went is we took 14 law students from Georgetown and 2 law professors from Georgetown for a week on a trip that we sponsored, where we plugged into the legal aid clinic in Dilley, Texas, because they have a legal aid clinic as part of this detention facility. And we basically helped the asylum seekers make their case. My wife just stepped down as the chair of the board of Georgetown Law School, so we worked through them and we funded the trip and we all went down there. And because we wanted to do something other than just talk about this. And it was an extraordinary experience because I sat there and listened to these women say why they're coming to our country. Because that's part of their asylum case. The way you seek asylum in this country, which is illegal, by the way, a lot of people don't think of it that way, is you come, you seek asylum, you have to make a case for credible fear. If that case is made successfully, you're granted temporary asylum status. You're allowed to locate with a sponsor, which is typically a family member or a nonprofit, and then you get assigned a final asylum hearing to make a determination whether your asylum is permanent. So we were helping them make that case for credible fear. And so you listen to their stories. And the stories are largely all the same. Gangs killed a child, or they threatened to kill a child. We went to law enforcement, and they're in bed with the gangs, so there's nothing we could do, so we had to leave. And so you sit there and you're like, well, they're doing what anyone would do. You know, there's nothing you wouldn't do to protect your kids. You don't care about what we're saying or what he's saying or whatever. You're just going to try to come. So we have to fix the situation in Central America. Unless we do that, this is going to continue. And the real thing that has to be fixed is there has to be kind of some civil society around the rule of law. And so what I want to do as president is something called Plan Central America, which is modeled off Plan Colombia, where I convene a summit of all the interested countries in the world, and there's a lot of them, and we work with non-governmental organizations to try to rebuild the civil institutions in those countries. And by getting all the countries together, we can put pressure on those countries to actually work with us because they'll have no choice. We have to do that. And while we're doing that, I want to pass comprehensive immigration reform. While we're doing that, we're still going to have the situation at the border. And we have to make sure that we conduct ourselves in ways that are consistent with our values. We shouldn't be separating children from their parents. We should make sure these facilities, treat people with a measure of dignity that's appropriate while we do our job.
Just on the Plan Central America, how's that better than like Julian Castro's Marshall Plan?
Probably similar.
Well, I mean, that kind of like just starts spending money right away with the immediacy of the crisis. Like how soon do you have the summit?
I mean, I would want to have the summit in the first 90 days. But this is the thing. You have to realize that a government's ability to affect what's going on in other countries is very limited. People who have been successful affecting what's going on in other countries are these NGOs, which typically have a lot more credibility. They're not really political. They're not really advancing an agenda some other country. And they typically are much more successful. So I view it, I think, again, I've modeled mine after this Plan Colombia, which did work. And, so I haven't really looked at the details of his, but mine is modeled after something we did once before a couple decades ago, and it worked. And it involves countries providing the financial support, but the NGOs executing.
And this also didn't really get brought up much during.
And it's not about just rebuilding them or infrastructure or any of that stuff. It's about actually getting some semblance of and I don't think we can objectively say our goal is actually ending corruption in this country. That's a pretty high bar. Our goal is actually making sure that people have some recourse, right, with law enforcement and the judicial system and some protections in their country, because that's what's causing them to leave.
Just on trade, real quick. So, just do you support the TPP
Yes.
USMCA basically Trump's NAFTA redux plan?
Yeah.
Do you think that works? And
I mean, look, I was a big supporter of TPP. I was one of Obama's point people on TPP. I thought it was a no-brainer. It was a no-brainer for us economically, and it would have been better if we paired it with infrastructure, which is what I encouraged the White House to do. But geopolitically in particular, you can't compete with China unless you compete. You can't deal with China unless you compete with them. And I don't think you can run against Trump unless you're pro-TPP. I just don't think you can. Because if you're against the TPP, you're basically endorsing his model of nationalism and isolationism. His new NAFTA is basically TPP. That piece of it, if you will. So, yeah.
So why do you think this issue suddenly kind of flipped on its head between the two major parties in 2016? I just kind of want to hear a little bit more, especially about, these kind of folks in the middle of the country everyone likes to talk about who feel really harmed by a lot of these global trade programs.
Well, they were harmed by it because we failed, right? I mean, the whole point about trade is we had to engage in the world, right? That was obvious. But where we failed is we didn't do anything to take care of the communities that were left behind by these decisions. And that's where the government failed. I mean, I think the government's got to do what's in the best interest of the American people, but it also has an obligation to take care of people who get left behind by a specific action the government takes. And that's where we failed, right? I think the American people are fine with us thinking globally as long as we continue to make sure people are investing locally. And it's that part that we failed. And the Delaney administration wants to advance trade deals as part of things like infrastructure programs, right? Where you're actually investing in communities while you're actually, thinking about how we compete globally. So I actually think we lost the election over this issue. Because President Obama stepped forward and wanted to do the TPP, and he was 100% right. And he was basically attacked by his own party as being some kind of a sellout to big business, which is ridiculous. You can criticize President Obama for whatever you want, but he's never been a sellout his whole life, in my opinion. And he was trying to do the right thing. The Democratic Party attacked him. Elizabeth Warren wrote an op-ed in the the Washington Post, slamming the TPP. She didn't even tell the administration she was doing it. The unions attacked him. They all attacked him. Created an opening for Trump. Put Hillary in a weird position. Everyone in the world knows that, Hillary said the TPP was the gold standard. Then she came out against it, and it just created this weird dynamic that I think created an opening for Trumpian economics, which is isolationism, nationalism, a rejection of our allies, this notion that we go it alone in the world, this notion that we think of the world like China does in a transactional lens. And I think we lost the high ground because of it. And that's why I think if you run against Trump and you were against the TPP, you're playing right into his hands because you don't have anything to say to him. But the party is changing because they see the dark side of nationalism. They see what's going on the border. They see us tearing up Paris. They see us questioning NATO. It's all the same. That's really how I think about it.
You talked a little bit about Medicare. Let's
Yeah.
talk more specifically about the Medicare and Social Security and the crippling costs that are a threat to that, and an aging population
Yeah.
for which the need for that
Yeah.
money is more dire. How do you reconcile that?
So, Social Security is pretty easy to fix. Medicare is a much different challenge. So let's talk about Social Security first. Social Security, we got to increase the cap. We got to make some adjustments about the rate of growth. We all could fix Social Security in 5 minutes here. I introduced the only bipartisan bill in the Congress to do it with Tom Cole, a great Republican from Oklahoma, where we proposed the Social Security Commission, which is the same thing that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan did, called the Greenspan Commission. You get 13 people off-site, they make small adjustments to it, they come back, it gets a vote in Congress, up or down. That we can fix. And I'm not actually that worried about us fixing it because it is so bipartisan, right? There's so much broad support for Social Security, as there should be, because it's arguably the most successful anti-poverty program this country's ever had, that it will get fixed, and it's easy to fix. It just takes some political will, and it takes a president who actually is willing to actually figure out the way to do it. And all you got to do is look at how we did it, Pat. You can't let Congress meddle with this too much. You actually have to have independent people come up with a proposal, and then you got to put it on the floor of the Congress for a yes or no vote. So they can't play games and poison it for political reasons. It's too important to let that happen. Medicare is more complicated because unlike Social Security, which is actually still solvent, even though people don't like to say that, because since inception we've paid more into Social Security than we've taken out. Medicare is different. Medicare is de-linked from a pay-for system a long time ago, and the federal government contributes massive amounts of money towards Medicare. And again, I don't think that's actually that controversial because I think the American people support that. The question is, how do you control healthcare costs? Because unless you control healthcare costs, then whether it's Medicare or private insurance, whatever the case may be, it gobbles up the resources of the country. So you have to control healthcare costs. I think ultimately there's really three ways to control healthcare costs. One is you have to have a universal system, because you've got all kinds of strange leakage right now with people not being in the system, where they don't get preventative care, or they go to the emergency rooms and stuff like that. So if you bite the bullet and create a universal system like I've talked about, you can get there. Secondly, you got to create incentives for people to actually really do cost controls. The Affordable Care Act had a bunch of those, and I actually think a bunch of them worked. You know, these readmission penalties, if you were basically churning patients, you get dinged on it. Those things have worked. We need more incentives for telemedicine. We need, everyone should be able to pull out their device before they go to the emergency room and talk to an emergency room specialist and say, I'm thinking I got to go to the emergency room. What do you think? We've all been there. Like, should I go? Shouldn't I go? Well, I might as well go. Right? And then 80% of the times you didn't really have to go. I've done it with my 4 kids. I can't tell you how many times. So it's like, listen, that we can avoid a lot of that stuff. Telemedicine, mental health, all these things we can do. We got to create incentives. But really, what we got to do? We got to invest in innovation. Because unless we cure Alzheimer's, unless we cure cancer, these things are just going to keep gobbling up our resources. The good news is we can do it. If you talk to scientists, they've never been more optimistic. Because what's available to investigators at the most basic level of science right now is something that they never had before, which is computing power and big data that is completely changing their ability to actually solve some of these problems. And I think, and that's one of the problems I have with this single payer system, I think upheaval to the healthcare system is not good for innovation, because we'll be spending all our time trying to figure out how to transition 1/6 of the U.S. economy to some new system. That's a crazy idea. But if we invest in innovation, really increase our investments in basic research, and you get huge returns on this. We're not talking trillions of dollars. I think we can cure Alzheimer's. I think we can cure cancer. I think we can create technologies that allow a physician effectively at their fingertips when they see a patient, for them to immediately get the intelligence of the best practices that the last 100,000 patients with a similar presenting symptoms, how they have actually been treated, what's worked, what hasn't worked. I mean, these things will be extraordinary in improving healthcare. I actually think there'll be a point in time in 30, 40 years from now, where people will say things like, wow, people used to get breast cancer. Isn't it amazing that we don't have that anymore? I actually think we can do it. And I think you've got to have a president who actually cares about making sure we take advantage of what I think we're in many ways at the threshold of a really extraordinary time in innovation in life sciences and healthcare, and in precision medicine, making sure, very precise treatments for what you have, early diagnostic using genetic testing where you can actually start dealing with things before they manifest or present themselves. And I think that's the ultimate way out. Because right now, just treating the illness is not going to be enough. It'll ultimately break the back of the budget.
Do you think the U.S. government should at least allow scientists to research things like CRISPR and gene editing software and all that, or do you think that's a bridge too far at the moment when you talk about kind of like really?
You mean like making people?
Well, no, but I mean, but CRISPR also has a lot of applications to, you like, what if you could like edit out the
Yeah.
eventuality of getting prostate cancer or something?
Yeah.
Would you
I mean,
do
I
that?
think people are going to be looking at all that stuff.
We will get to the foreign policy.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
No, it's
also
okay.
deep.
We gotta. I'm not sure how much.
Well, we're getting up against it time-wise.
My foreign policy is pro-allies. Trump's anti-allies, we're pro-allies. No, seriously, I think our allies are the greatest asset we have foreign policy-wise.
Yeah.
And we need to be building them and working with them. All these problems the United States has solved. I think of a big like Thanksgiving table, and we're sitting at the head.
Sure.
We work together and solve these problems.
We just need one that's
Political
got a-
brevity I've never heard before.
What's that?
Pro-allies, that's political
Yes.
brevity I've
But you
never
just-
But that's what I am.
On Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, since we've been
Withdraw, but not fully. I mean, I think we have 14,000 troops in Afghanistan. I think 5,000 in Iraq. I think we have to reduce that dramatically. But I don't think we can get to zero right now because I think it is in our national interest to have a presence there working with local security forces to ensure that these places don't become breeding grounds of terrorism.
Yeah. And
In Syria, we got some different objectives. We got to deal with the 70,000 ISIS detainees. We got to deal with the Kurds, how they get resettled. So the Syria withdrawal is tied to some different benchmarks.
Yeah, and is there a foreign policy position you hold that you would be not willing to change when confronted with some classified intelligence that you're unaware of now?
Well, I don't know how I can answer that because it's premised on intelligence that I'm unaware of.
Sorry. Fair enough.
I'm pretty pro-ally, so I don't see how any intelligence would tell me that I suddenly should pursue the Trump approach to the world, which is go it alone. So that I wouldn't change. And I think how I would think about deploying troops, I wouldn't change either, which is, I think it's the most sacred responsibility of a president. I think a president should listen to advisors, should try to hear both sides of an argument, should use judgment acquired across a lifetime. And I think a president should walk around Arlington National Cemetery before they actually make the order and make sure they'd be willing to pick up a phone and tell a family member that I really believed we had to do this.
Okay, before we wrap up, so you're gearing toward the 2020 election. It's coming up faster than people think, and when it does, you want to make sure that everybody who wants to vote for John Delaney actually has their vote for John Delaney count.
Yes.
So you've talked about hardening our infrastructure
Yes.
around election security.
Sure.
What does that mean?
So it means prohibiting foreign entities from owning critical vendors. It's not prohibited now.
Okay.
It means making sure states and local governments who inherently run election systems, which is actually a nice safeguard because it's so decentralized, like you can't go to one place and hack into it. So I'm actually okay with that. But making sure they have the resources to actually buy best-in-class systems. And it means passing laws that require full disclosure of any political advertising, whether it's on broadcast or social media. Because if I run an ad or anyone runs an ad in your paper, politically, they have to disclose who paid for it. That's not true on social media. It's ridiculous.
That's highly encouraged, by the way.
What's that?
Advertisements in our paper.
Yeah. And then just some framework for requiring social media companies to take down deep fakes unless they're fully disclosed. So I think I want to harden the persuasion aspect of our elections, and then I want to harden the actual execution of our elections. That's how I would think about it.
All right.
Thanks for having
it was
me.
fun.
This was a great discussion.
Yeah, it was great to have you here.
This was for me. Can't say it was for you guys.
I'm ready.
But it was good.
I'm ready to have a sidebar and solve Social Security. Make some headlines.
Really.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, it's like, the hardest thing on Social Security is this retirement age. Because for the first time, we're not living longer. And poor people definitely don't live longer. So if you raise the retirement age too high, then poor people aren't going to get it. So the retirement age is actually what people often think you need to go to, but I've actually become convinced you can't raise the retirement age unless you means test it. So you got to do it with raising the cap, which is not hard to do. And then what Obama proposed, which is this change CPI stuff, that you got to do that too. You do those two things, we'd extend it for 75 years. And the beauty is like none of those changes would kick in for 15 years because that's the way you kind of got to do it. And it's like the Congress would pass it. But you can't let members of Congress amend it because you can't trust these people. Because they'll take a good common sense deal, and for political reasons, they'll put a poison pill in it.
Sure.
And that's what Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan figured out. They said, let them cut the deal. You send 13 people, Democrats and Republicans. You require a supermajority of them. And what you really want is them to have a unanimous resolution. So they come back with something unanimous, 13 Democrats, Republicans. And then you just say it's going to get a vote. You can't touch it. You can vote no if you want. So if you don't like it, vote no. Remember, you're not going to vote to extend Social Security for 75 years, so think about your no vote. And just like it happened in the 80s, it would pass. And this is not a problem. You know why this isn't a problem? Because the American people support this program so overwhelmingly that we'll ultimately do what I just said.
But we've been talking about it for
I know,
years and years, and
agree it would
nothing's
be,
happened.
and whatever that piece of paper, it would be a lot easier if you did it today versus 5 years. And that's the problem. But ultimately, if we don't do this by 2032, 33, the number moves around a little bit, we're going to have a 25% to Social Security cut to Social Security benefits by law. I think we all know that's never going to happen. Like that is never going to happen.
It's an easy
You'll never see a bigger turnover in the Congress of the United States in the history of this country if that were to happen. Literally 90% of the members of Congress would lose their seats if that happened. It's never going to happen. But it would be better. And that's why I'm going to put a commission bill with my friend Tom Cole from Oklahoma, who's a great Republican in Congress. And that's why I was I was ranked the third most bipartisan member of Congress, because I did stuff like that. And that was just common sense, like we didn't come up with anything new. We're like, they dealt with this before, what did they do? And we looked and we're like, well, that was a pretty good idea, let's just do it again. Fix what's broken, keep what's working. The way you fix Social Security is by copying what worked before. Thanks for having me.